Thank you for agreeing to meet with me today. I want to start by asking you, why is it that you're campaigning for a second referendum?
I want to stop Brexit, and I have done since the 2017 election, when at that point I didn't think that Brexit was... I've always thought it was wrong for us as a country to be leaving the European Union, but I thought it was also not viable to leave in 2017. Not viable in a policy sense, in that Theresa May had committed herself to a form of hard Brexit I thought couldn't be delivered. But I also thought it wasn't politically viable, because part of the reason why she lost her majority in 2017 is that she was coming over as too extreme on Brexit. And the electorate, who in aggregate, in my experience, are pretty wise in Britain because we're a mature democracy, sort of sussed that. They wanted a softer form of Brexit, and then she wouldn't give them the softer form of Brexit. Instead of doing what she should have done after the 2017 election, which was to open negotiations with Labour on what would be a viable way forward, which I think would have got us to some form of soft Brexit followed by a referendum, which I would have supported. I would have supported that as a package. Get the best soft Brexit deal you can do, and then put it to a referendum. Obviously, I would have campaigned to remain, but that would have been. But she didn't. Instead, what she actually did was to hold her red lines, form the confidence and supply agreement with the DUP. So effectively, she moved to the right, not to the centre. And from that moment on, I started. Well, I was still chairman of the National Infrastructure Commission at the time, so I didn't resign until the end of 2017. But from a few months after the 2017 election, I started campaigning full-time against it, because I believed it was not just wrong, but also unviable and not even popular. So if you've got a policy that's wrong, unviable, and isn't what the people want, then, and it's a big issue like this, then the right thing to do is to seek to stop it.
That's all well and true, but just one question that I have is, what would you say to the many millions of people who still think that leaving the European Union is what they want, what they voted for, and ultimately what they want to see delivered?
That's why I'm in favour of a referendum. If I was waving two fingers to the voters, or to what the voters might think, as it happens, I think the majority are in favour of remaining now. But if I was doing that, then I'd just be in favour of a revoke, and a parliamentary vote to revoke, and no referendum. It's because of this interplay that we've got between direct democracy and parliamentary democracy is working at the moment, because we did hold the referendum 3 years ago, that I think the way to bring Brexit to a halt is through a referendum, and not just through a parliamentary vote. In normal circumstances, we're in abnormal circumstances. In normal circumstances, the right thing to do would be for Parliament to take the decision. But it's because we are in this abnormal situation of there having been a referendum 3 years ago, that now that circumstances have clearly developed, they've both changed and developed. They've developed because we now have a deal. There wasn't a deal 3 years ago, and there couldn't have been a deal. But as well as developing, I think also public opinion has changed, as people have seen the impact of Brexit, or the likely impact. And for those reasons, I think the right thing to do is have a referendum.
Obviously, the European election showed that British politics is very much broken. Do you not think that Labour has completely fractured under the pressure of Brexit? Do you think that as a party, it would be fit to essentially heal the divisions that Brexit has caused?
Well, today, in reaction to the European elections, actually, and the local elections that went before, Jeremy Corbyn has made a big move. He has now said that Labour would not only support a referendum on any Conservative deal, which we've come close to saying in the past. We hadn't said on any Conservative deal. We said to stop no deal in the past, but on any deal coming from Boris Johnson, we'd support a referendum and we'd campaign to remain. Now, that you said that politics is broken. It's not my view that it is broken. My view is that actually our parliamentary system is working as well as it could in the circumstances, given that you had this great crisis brought about by Parliament and the people taking a different view 3 years ago. And part of the evidence that it's working is the people having made very clear in the European elections they didn't like Labour sitting on the fence. Let's be clear, I was a candidate, and I know only too well that they didn't want Labour sitting on the fence. We have now come off the fence.
But it was also said, because obviously the trade unions kind of forced the Labour leadership to agree that position, but it was said that if the Labour Party won a general election, that they would still try to pursue a Brexit deal of their own. Does that not suggest that they're not fully in support of Remain, and that they're only actually doing it to stop a Tory Brexit and not actually for, you know, the cause of remaining in the European Union entirely?
I'm not happy with our position at the moment. I think it needs greater clarity, and we need to be very clear that we're not going to be seeking to negotiate any different form of Brexit. And that is the only, as it were, you know, we've met almost all the criteria now for having a pro-Remain policy, but the last issue is what would happen if there were a general election. Now, in practice, I don't think there is going to be a general election because Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, and I don't think Boris Johnson is going to be voting to be the shortest-lived Prime Minister since Lord Godric in 1826, I think it was.
2 months in office.
So, yeah and that's two centuries ago.
Yes,
so
yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen. Did you do A-level history?
Yes.
So
yes.
you know about Lord Godric?
Yeah, appreciate
Is it 1826?
Yes, 1826, yes.
Well, I don't think he's going to want to go there.
No.
And indeed, his seat, Uxbridge, is highly vulnerable. He could lose it in an election. So I don't think there will be an early election. So I think us having said that we're now in favour of a referendum and will on any deal coming out of Boris Johnson, and we campaign to Remain, I think that is now a straightforward Remain position. But to make assurance doubly sure, I think we should now make clear that also that if there were to be a general election, our policy would be the same.
Will that, do you think, now clarifying their standpoint on Brexit, do you think that that will heal the divisions within the Labour Party itself? Because obviously we've seen that the North are very opposed to the whole idea of a second referendum, whereas the South are, more, appealing of it. Would you agree that this new position will essentially heal the divisions within the party itself?
Well, it won't heal them until our position is entirely clear. And I don't deal I've got where I am in politics by dealing in getting 60-70% of what you need. We need to get the 100%. And I don't believe that we will actually win this battle until our position is completely clear. And my own experience in the European elections, because I'm a sort of unusual member of the House of Lords who actually not only I speak up in another country at meetings all the time, but I've also fought an election recently, it's very clear to me that a compromise policy on an issue like this, where you can't be half in or half out of the European Union, and there isn't going to be a credible fantasy, Labour Brexit, that's not going to happen. So we've got to get the policy completely clear, and it's still not completely clear. But we're getting there, and I hope we take the final steps sooner rather than later.
Obviously, my next question follows on from what you say. We've seen the Labour position change regularly or be completely unclear. Do you think, based on that Jeremy Corbyn is fit to be Prime Minister?
If we get to the right policy, yeah. Because what matters about governments is what they do. And some pretty unlikely people have become Prime Minister, but if you get the right policy, they can be successful. And what I'm trying to work to, because let's be clear, Jeremy Corbyn wasn't my first choice as being leader of the Labour Party, but if we can get to the right policy, and that's what matters to the British people, is we get the right policy, which in this crisis we're in at the moment means stopping Brexit, then I think a Jeremy Corbyn government would be entirely viable. With the wrong policy, then as it happens, I don't think he'd get elected in the first place, because what we've seen, we spent 2 years thinking that the main opposition really to Labour in terms of being able to win an election and form a government was from the right. It was the Conservatives, and we were very worried also by UKIP, what morphed into being the Brexit Party with Farage. But actually what the recent months have shown us, which was no surprise to me, because I'm well aware of how the middle classes think in England, is that politics abhors a vacuum, and what we essentially did ourselves was to resurrect the Liberal Democrats by leaving the Remain space open when Brexit was so clearly failing. We basically told the Liberal Democrats, would you please get out of your grave? We literally, it was like Lazarus, this is when they had no leader. Vince was nowhere, he was on his way out. Remember, he was the worst failure of a political leader in recent times. And we had Change, which came along, and Change were busy lecturing the Lib Dems about why they were useless and they couldn't hack it. And what we did in the European elections, by not having a clear-cut referendum, Remain, and then if we win that, revoke position, is we literally recreated the Lib Dems. Now that is a standing warning to us as to what will happen in a general election if our position isn't clear. Because what will happen, I have no doubt at all about it, is that we will face another big switch over to the Lib Dems. And as it happens, it's slightly unpredictable what will happen politically then because of our electoral system. But what I think is very unlikely to happen as a result of that is a majority Labour government.
Yes. My next question is, obviously you said at the beginning of this interview that you feel personally Brexit is a mistake. Why is it then, in your opinion, that Nigel Farage's Brexit Party cleaned the floor in the European elections?
Well, they didn't clean the floor. They were the single most popular party because the Remain vote was so split. It was split in 3 ways: Labour, Lib Dem, Green. But it was, as a further gloss on that, of course, because Labour's position wasn't entirely clear, pundits, particularly pundits who were anti-Labour were busy arguing that a lot of the Labour vote wasn't a Remain vote, when in fact actually overwhelmingly it was. Now the Lib Dems and the Greens alone outpolled the Brexit Party. Lib Dems, Greens, Change and Labour was 60% and was significantly higher as a percentage than UKIP plus the Conservatives have got in the last European elections. So the moral of the European elections, to my mind, is that there is now an anti-Brexit majority in the country, but it's split. Now actually the Brexit majority is split to some extent because you've got Farage and the Conservatives. And that will matter much more in a general election because Conservatives aren't going to go down to whatever it was, 9% that the Tories got in the European elections. But the side that will win on this, in my view, is the side that's least split. So if Boris and Farage manage to do some kind of electoral pact, then we have a big issue on the Remain side as to how we react to that. As it happens, I think it's going to be very difficult for Boris and Farage. They're two scorpions in the jar together, and I've got a feeling that the only way that one was resolved is by one of them killing the other. Yeah. And by the way, I think it will be Farage that will kill Boris. And I think Boris sort of senses that. Yes. If there were to be an electoral pact between them, my own view is that Farage will end up as leader of the Conservative Party quite quickly, because he's by far the more dominant and effective politician amongst those two. But the moral for Labour from the European elections is that we have got to become the largest and dominant Remain party, because it's the only way that you can take on the Conservatives and Farage.
So really the moral of what you're saying is that when the various Remain factions, I guess you could call them, unite, then it will be very much the Remain that could win future elections.
But it has to be led by Labour.
Yes.
It has to be led by Labour, partly because I'm Labour, so of course I want it to be led by Labour. But the other reason why it has to be led by Labour is the only credible anti-Conservative party that could win an election. Lib Dems obviously can't win an election. I mean, they might be able to restore themselves in places where they held parliamentary seats before they were wiped out in 2015, but they've never held more than 59 parliamentary seats. We have in the House of Commons at the moment 253 Labour MPs. So clearly, if there's to be a non-Conservative government, it has to be Labour-led. If it's going to be a majority government against the Conservatives against Brexit, that can only come from Labour.
Would you ever, in a general election scenario, you didn't win the set number of seats to form a majority government, would you ever consider going into coalition with the Liberal Democrats?
Well, I wouldn't be, let's be clear, I was part of the negotiating team in 2010 for Gordon Brown when there was a hung parliament, and we did seek to get a coalition. I'm not so close to Jeremy Corbyn, I'm likely to be one of his negotiators in a hung parliament, so I don't know how he would approach that, but I imagine that if he's the largest party, he would want some arrangement with the Lib Dems, and I would strongly support that.
Yes. I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard, that the recent events of James Dyson and other large companies relocating Singapore is nothing to do with Brexit. Would the economic arguments, therefore, that you and other Remain campaigners have peddled, would you argue that that's scaremongering? If these multinational corporations that have moved outside of the UK and have said that it is not anything to do with Brexit, surely that means that your arguments are scaremongering.
But it is to do with Brexit. I mean,
they're just putting a veil on it.
Yeah, of course. Well, they don't want to be rude to the British government. They have business to do in Britain, and they want good relations with the government. But the fact these aren't all coincidences. It's not a coincidence that Nissan plus Honda plus, you can go down the list of them, plus BMW plus Hitachi, that they've all said that they're withdrawing investment from Britain or won't make the next generation of investment. What is the one common theme which links all of this over the last 6 months? It's been the prospect of either a no-deal Brexit or a hard Brexit. And whereas they might have been prepared to go along with a Brexit deal which guaranteed customs arrangements and regulatory arrangements, so it still made it possible for them to export to Europe, as that's now become deeply uncertain, they've started moving their investment elsewhere, and that is tragic for Britain. But what is the right lesson to draw from that now? It's don't do Brexit. It's not to see it through. I mean, that's be ludicrous. You start, having cut off your fingers, you start bleeding badly. The idea that the answer to that is therefore to cut off your arm, I mean, is so obviously lunatic that nobody but that Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson would go along with that.
What in your opinion, is the single biggest motivating factor for remaining in the European Union?
Well, I think with the public, the single biggest factor is jobs and living standards, and that's what tilted it in 1975, and that's what I think will tilt it this year we have a referendum. And I think part of the reason why we lost it 3 years ago was that what people dubbed Project Fear, but which I just take to be a realistic assessment of what's going to happen to jobs in the economy, people didn't buy that. At least they didn't fully buy it 3 years ago. It was a very narrow result, 52-48, but they didn't fully buy it. In 1975, I'm a bit too young to remember 1975 personally, but lots of my family and relations voted, and what they all voted for then, crucially, was to stay in the common market because they thought our jobs wouldn't be secure outside it. Now 3 years on, Project Fair is becoming Project Reality, and I think that means that the next referendum will be won. But the real reason why that's hugely important, but when I say the bigger reason why I'm strongly pro-European in favour of the EU is I see it as a really important, indeed the only effective peace project that we've got in Europe. If we start separating ourselves off, particularly from France and Germany, because there are three big economic and security powers in Europe, if we separate ourselves off, even worse, if we start falling out with France and Germany, then I think the peace and security of Europe is in jeopardy. And what we've seen this week with Trump effectively expelling the British ambassador from Washington at the same time as we have Putin, who has done a chemical weapons attack on Salisbury. If you just think what's been happening without the two big superpowers to our west and to our east, what is the moral that you draw? That we work with our European partners more closely, or that we take our chances as a small country in a world where the two dominant powers are Trump and Putin? I mean, this is a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it?
You have said, and I think it's kind of widely held to be sacrosanct, that holding the referendum in the first place was a mistake. Why do you think then that Brexit won?
Because it was so big a mistake.
So you think that the reason people voted, yes, by quite a narrow majority, but you think that the people voted because it was a mistake, or a lack of facts, or even the electoral fraud?
No, the whole way that the referendum was held was wrong. That if you're going to do something as trying to use neutral language, as bold and consequential for the country as Brexit, if you're going to put that before the people and you're going to ask them to form a view on it, then it was obvious to me at the time, and I said it at the time, that the only way of doing that credibly is to know what the deal is you're going to put to them when you put it to a referendum. And that can only be either by not holding the referendum until you've actually got a putative exit deal, or what Jacob Rees-Mogg himself said at the time, which is that we should hold what he himself called a dual referendum. A dual referendum being a referendum in two parts. That's the more logical way of thinking of it than two referendums. The first part being authorising the government to negotiate a deal, and the second part being the people giving their approval once they've seen the deal. Now, either of those, I think, in sort of terms of policy, would have been viable. Either not to have held the referendum until you've actually negotiated the deal, or to do the dual referendum. But to hold a referendum on a unicorn, which is, do you want to leave the European Union, when David Cameron was out-campaigned, but there was always a likelihood that he would be out-campaigned because he had Farage out there, who is a master campaigner, and who could put every unicorn going as to all of the benefits. Indeed, it wasn't only the Farage unicorns, we also had the Boris Johnson unicorns, and we had the Michael Gove unicorns. So we were having literally everything by leaving the EU. We were going to sort out the North-South divide, poverty was going to be abolished, we'd be able to negotiate the best trade deals ever, we'd have a shed load of money for the NHS, do you remember? All of those things, all of those unicorns were charging around the country. Why? Because there hadn't been any negotiation. Of course you could promise the earth. I mean, it's not so complicated politics, this. I suppose looking back on it, the surprise was that the majority against was only 52-48.
And obviously, when you listen to analysts, and indeed I think there was a professor from Cambridge who said that actually the supposed electoral fraud that took place by Vote Leave and Be Leave actually potentially influenced around 800,000 people to vote on the final week of campaigning, which would then explain why the majority was so small. And you could even argue, as the Sue Wilson versus Prime Minister case did, that actually the referendum was achieved, or the Brexit was achieved, by illicit means.
Well, I don't myself go there. I mean, there are a lot of people on the Remain side who say that the massive illegality and all that. I certainly think the police need to sort out what did happen, but we cannot in this country get into the business of starting to invalidate election or referendum results because they go go against us. And to be, I've got quite a lot of international experience. And if we think our elections and the way we conduct them are a bit suspect, then there is no country in the world that's as good as us outside maybe Scandinavia and possibly Germany. So, and I'm not in favour of the wholesale invalidation of elections. So my view of it is, don't go there. See that the people who broke the law, if they broke the law, are dealt with, and learn the lessons for the next referendum. And the big lesson is we've got to have this properly regulated. But I'm not in any way seeking to invalidate the last election result, or even to argue that it's somehow invalid, even if you can't legally invalidate it because of things that happened. The truth is, David Cameron chose to hold a referendum. Parliament agreed the terms. Parliament actually agreed the regulatory structure that was too weak, as it happens, and we lost. So the right thing to do next time, now that we can see the deal, is to win.
Yes.
It's not to start arguing over.
But if the law has been broken and there are electoral laws in place,
that should be dealt with.
It should be dealt with.
But we can't invalidate the result.
Even if the rules have been broken, then what kind of example would that set if we're allowing a referendum to be treated as binding, even though the way in which it was achieved was potentially corrupted?
Yeah. Well, my view is that of course we need a second referendum because.
So you think that that's the solution,
yeah, that is the
solution. as well
yes.
as...
But it's not to somehow invalidate the last election, the last referendum. Indeed, I'm not quite sure what invalidating it would mean, because it was advisory. Its authority, in fact, depends upon the authority that politicians give it. And we've got a government in place at the moment that's determined to try and negotiate some kind of Brexit. So I don't think that leads anywhere at all. Because if you tried to invalidate the referendum by putting a motion in Parliament or something, it would fail. So what is the way to deal with it, in my view? It's for the law to pursue people who it's alleged have broken the law. Obviously that should happen. But then if we have a second referendum, to see that we learn the lessons. And there are a number of lessons, one of which is we need stronger regulation, another of which I think is that we can only have one Leave and one Remain campaign next time, because last time we had two Leave campaigns, one of which was mainstream Conservatives that seemed to keep within the law, but then we had the Wild West campaign of Aaron Banks and Farage and all of that, where it appears that almost anything went.
Obviously the first referendum was, as you said, advisory, non-binding, and that is kind of being used as a reason as to why we shouldn't be implementing the result of that referendum. The second referendum will also be advisory and non-binding because, as you say, it's set down by the regulatory framework. Why should we treat that somehow as sacrosanct, as that result is more legitimate than the first?
Well, I'm not, because we're a parliamentary democracy, and what actually matters in our system is what Parliament decides to do. So if Parliament decides after a second referendum that it doesn't like the result, of course it can do that anyway. It's my view that Parliament will go with the result of a second referendum, because we've now had such a long impasse. A clear proposition will be put to them, and I think Parliament will respect it. But I can't, and you can't, no one can in our system say precisely what Parliament would do or circumscribe it, because we don't have a constitution like Switzerland, which gives the people the right to override Parliament by calling for a referendum. In our system, referendums themselves only happen if Parliament calls them, which is why we had the last referendum, it's why we would have the next referendum, and then what Parliament chooses to do after is what Parliament chooses to do. And of course the people then can and do make their judgment in a general election, but Parliament between general elections is sovereign.
My final question, Lord Adonis, is do you think Britain can ever move forward from this Brexit chaos, even with a second referendum and the result being Remain? There are still going to be divisions ultimately between people who support Brexit, whether there is a second referendum or not, or whether there is evidence, as you say, Project Reality, to prove them wrong. Do you think that we can move on as a country and heal those divisions entirely?
I think we can, but it's going to be very tough. I think it can only be done on the basis of staying in the EU, because I don't think anything else is actually going to deliver the prosperous economy, which is at the root of a lot of the Brexit concerns. See, the big unfortunate, but I can understand it because we had the unicorns charging around, the big unfortunate thing which happened 3 years ago was, because I don't think anybody voted to be poorer. I mean, maybe Rees-Mogg and a few other people who've got nothing to lose might sacrifice a bit of their unearned income from it. But certainly the great majority of the people who voted in the 52% did not vote to be poorer. What happened was that they were persuaded because of the unicorns, that you could leave the European Union and be better off. And in particular, they were persuaded that we were giving shed loads of money to Europe, which would come their way afterwards. Now, that was a lie. Indeed, we know it's a lie now because the exit deal is that we give them 39 billion, not that they give us hundreds of millions for the NHS. So it is my view, as a matter of fact, that the only thing that can make people more prosperous is staying in the EU. If we can deal with this prosperity thing, which means partly staying in and then having big reform once we stay in, we need a fairer society here, to be blunt. We need another Labour government which does roughly what the Blair and Brown governments did, which is to really invest in the public services and see that we have a fairer and more efficient society. If we can do that, then I think we can lay to rest the ghost of Brexit so far as the majority of people are concerned. There will still be 5–10% of people on the right of politics who are extreme nationalists and think that irrespective of whether we're going to be better off or worse off, we should leave Europe, which of course is where Farage started. He started with that group. But it's my judgment that that group is 5 to 10%. It is not 30, 40, let alone 50%. So if we get to the right place on resolving Brexit by not doing it, and we deal with these underlying social and economic challenges, which I think help to account for the Brexit majority, then we can be okay. But it's not going to be easy, and politics is rough trade, and I think we could have quite a rough referendum campaign. But I say rough. I don't think we're going to be facing riots on the streets or social unrest or anything of that kind. That doesn't happen in this country. It's going to be rough, but I think we can get through it. And I'm a professional optimist. I think when, Oliver, you come and see me in a year's time and we do an interview on what happened in the intervening year, I think we'll have held the referendum, we'll have voted to stay in the EU, we'll be on a process of reform, and we will regard this as an object lesson of Britain having started to get things wrong before democracy kicked in and corrected it.
And on that positive note, Lord Adonis, thank you very much
Thank you
for meeting with me.